What's up, everyone? It's Mr. Lamb here. This is going to be the first of probably a few of these online lecture videos. I've decided that this is just the easiest way for me to get you the information that you need to know from me. I obviously can't do lectures in person for quite a while. You know that we've already had one video where I explained everything that was going on with AP. So in this video, the goal is we're just going to go through our next piece of content, which is the New Deal. We have two more things to talk about in the class, and that is the New Deal and the Great Depression and World War II. So that's what we're going to be doing in these videos. So here's how this is going to work for y'all. Before every class, which our classes are going to be on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I will upload one of these videos. Y'all will then watch the video at your house and answer the question form that I'm going to upload with this. So as I am talking throughout this video and you're watching, you can actually answer the questions. And then the questions will be due on Google Classroom, need to be emailed to me, and I've put all the instructions on Google Classroom on how you're going to do that by the next class. And then the next class on Thursday will upload another video. The next thing I want to talk about is that we're going to be meeting on Google Meet on Thursday. We just need to meet. We need to talk face to face. There have been some developments as far as the AP test. We need to go through that. I want to talk to each of you about how you're going to be studying over these next few days and how everything's going to be working. So we're going to be meeting on Thursday. So Thursday at noon, wherever you are, you need to be near your email because I'm going to send the invitation via email. Okay, so that doesn't mean turn on your computer at noon because we all know it sometimes takes a long time for your computer to turn on. Log into your computer, log into your email, and then accept the invitation. Okay, everyone is required to be there. You guys still have grades. Being there, showing up, that is a grade. So if you're not there, you're not going to get a grade for it. So everyone needs to show up. Everyone needs to be there. Everyone needs to participate in our meeting. It won't take long, probably 15-20 minutes, just for me to get all the information I know about the AP test and about what's going on with our class to you. We probably will meet maybe once a week, but even sometimes probably once every 2 weeks, depending on how long this here quarantine goes on. The next thing is just the class structure, how that's going to work. Again, we're going to start with these videos until we finish the content. So I'm going to do videos. You're going to answer questions on the video. After we finish that, we're going to work on SAQs because SAQs are the most likely thing to show up on the test. So starting next week, you'll be doing some SAQ practice before we move on to World War II. Then we'll finish World War II, do the same thing, and then we will start the actual review process. So that's how the class structure is going to work. Other than that, remember that my office hours are from 12 to 4 from Monday to Thursday, 12 to 4. So at any point from 12 to 4, you can email me and I can answer all your questions. And our class period is Tuesday and Thursday from noon to 1 o'clock. Tuesday and Thursday from noon to 1 o'clock. So at that point, I'm literally focused on your class, and so we can figure out a way to talk then. If you have any questions about that, shoot me an email. Let me know. So the first thing we need to do before we start talking about the New Deal is we need to do a recap of what we talked about before the break. And the last thing we talked about was the Great Crash of 1929. Now remember, the Great Crash of 1929 only refers to the stock market crash that happened in October of 1929 that ended that huge bull market and turned into a bear market. Now the stock market crash itself is often sort of synonymous with the Great Depression, but it is not. It itself was only an immediate cause of the Great Depression, but it didn't start the Great Depression. It started a recession. What turned the recession caused by the Great Crash into a depression was the failure of banks. Because banks had over speculated so much into the economy with almost no government regulation, when the economy started to crash in 1929, the runs on banks started. Everyone started trying to get their money out of the bank, and the banks didn't have enough money. And so what we end up seeing is some major, major failure of banks, meaning that many people, but also many, many businesses lost all the money that they had in banks. And since banks were not insured by the federal government, something that FDR is going to change, no one was able to get their money back. If you lost your money because the bank failed, you just lost your money and there was nothing anyone could do to help you. These runs on banks are going to cause massive, massive unemployment for many reasons. First off, you now have businesses failing, so anyone who worked for those failing businesses is now unemployed. And then also, anyone who still had money stops spending their money. They just start saving their money, which sounds good for that person, but for the overall economy, we need people to spend money. That's how our economy functions. So, for example, right now, one of the major causes of the recession that we're in due to coronavirus is that people just aren't spending as much money as they were. People aren't spending money on planes. They're not spending money on vacations. They're not spending money even to go to the grocery store the way that we used to go. And that is causing the economy to crash because businesses just aren't making much money. And when businesses can't make money, they can't pay their employees. Employees become unemployed, and that is what causes sort of a downward spiral of the economy. Other causes of the Great Depression are going to be overproduction of goods. Remember, during World War I, America had kind of become the grocery store for the world. Because Europe was in a war with each other, they could no longer produce the goods because they had to focus on producing war material. So America becomes the breadbasket. They start feeding Europe. But after the war, Europe starts to recover and they no longer need American goods. So America had stepped up its production. They had produced more goods to feed all of Europe as well as the Americas. Now that Europe doesn't need them, they don't cease that increase of production. They're still producing the same amount of goods, but there aren't as many people who want those goods. So in other words, the supply of goods is still really high, but the demand for those goods has gone down, meaning that there's a surplus. And a surplus results in major deflation. Okay, deflation, because the price of goods is going to go down because there's just not much of a demand, which is really, really bad for the people producing goods. And one group, often forgotten when we talk about the New Deal, that is supremely affected by this is farmers. Once again, deflation absolutely kills the price of the goods that farmers make. Another big cause is income inequality. When we think about the Roaring Twenties, when you think about Great Gatsby, when you think about 20s parties, you think about this illustrious, super, super rich people. You have to remember that that's a very small portion of the population. The Roaring Twenties was a big deal. That's why we talked about it so much. But in 1929, despite the fact that the U.S. economy was soaring, 50% of Americans lived below the poverty line. Okay, those 50%, they're going to be the ones who are absolutely killed. That's another thing we should remember right now as we get into this economy and we start seeing the economy crash. The most vulnerable people are the people who were poor before the economy starts to crash. Yes, a lot of people are losing a lot of money right now, but the people who didn't have any money to begin with, they're going to be the people who are hurt the worst. Okay, they're the first people who are fired. They're the first people who start to lose everything. Another problem, and this one's obvious, is irresponsible and unstable banking. Banks had no regulation. There was no referee telling the banks what they could and couldn't do. And so they did some very nefarious things, and they screwed over a lot of people, specifically the people who had put money into their banks. And their over-speculation, which is one of the main causes of the Great Crash of 1929, leads banks to fail. And when banks start failing massively, people stop putting their money in banks, which is bad for the overall economy because businesses really can't function if they can't use banks. And we do need banks. It's not like banks are like the end. There's a reason we use banks. They're important. But because there's so much failure of banks, people lose faith in the banking system. And then the next one is just the weak international economy. Countries rely on each other. When one country's economy crashes, it hurts the countries around that. And theirs is no different. When the U.S. economy crashes, it's a domino effect. It tears down every other country with it, meaning that there are no other countries who can bail the United States out, because every country is going to go through the Great Depression with only a few exceptions. The next thing is, let's just talk about the effects of the Great Depression as it stood in 1932. The main effect was you have massive, massive unemployment, the highest unemployment that this country has ever seen and most likely will ever see. That's 33% of the working population was unemployed as of 1932. Okay, 33%. So 1/3 of everyone who was able to hold a job didn't have a job. Okay, that means that those people aren't making money, which means they're not investing into the economy, and it's just absolutely killing. Unemployment is bad. We don't want unemployment to go up. But to put this in perspective, in the Great Recession of 2008, the highest unemployment ever got was about 10%. And people freaked out about it, but that is not 33%. 10% is really, really bad, but 33% is horrible, and it's never been that bad ever since. So one major problem FDR is going to have to deal with is how to fix unemployment. The next one is 25% of banks have failed. Okay, so 1/4 of the U.S. banking system no longer exists because it's failed. And again, there's no banking insurance, so they've taken everyone's money with them. The next thing is that 25% of farmers have lost their farms. Okay, so farmers are especially hard hit by this. And if 25% of farmers lose their farms, if you're a farmer and you don't have a farm, you're unemployed. And then thousands of businesses also fail, meaning that everyone who worked for those businesses is also out of the job. All right, so now we're going to talk about FDR, the man who's going to try to deal with the Great Depression. So, as we know, from 1928 to 1932, Herbert Hoover was the president of the United States, and he was incredibly unpopular, mainly due to his inability to deal with the Great Depression. Now, it starts out as kind of a stubbornness. Remember, Hoover believed in what was called rugged individualism. He literally believed that the government should never intervene in the economy. However, once unemployment starts to get so high and Americans really start to suffer, Hoover does change a little bit and he does try to help. However, it's ineffective. So in the 1932 election, it turns into a landslide victory for FDR and the Democrats. Not only does FDR win the presidency, and he wins 42 of 48 states, but the Democrats are able to take both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And that's going to be important because it essentially gives FDR a mandate to do whatever he wants. Because since he has Democratic Congress, he can pass whatever he needs to pass to get all this done. So we see this today where there's a Republican president and a Republican Senate, but there's a Democratic House, how they're having trouble passing these stimulus packages to deal with the recession that we're currently in. FDR doesn't have that problem. And so he's going to be able to pass as much legislation as he wants. The next thing that we're going to talk about is who is FDR? I mean, who's this guy who's going to deal with? If you are doing a list of greatest presidents of all time, FDR is almost universally in the top 3, and many people even have him as the best. So let's talk about that, why exactly that was. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he is the probably he is the 4th or 5th cousin, I'm not sure which, of Theodore Roosevelt. He was born into a very wealthy New York family, so he doesn't have your typical background as the man of the people that he will soon become. However, he has a place in history as potentially one of the most popular U.S. presidents of all time. Rich people often called him a traitor to his class because he did believe that the rich should be taxed more than the poor. He's famously contracted polio in his 40s in 1921, which took away his ability to walk. He was paralyzed from the waist down. Now, it was an open secret in Washington Everyone kind of knew about it. However, most of the American public did not realize that their president was paralyzed. Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, was actually a moderate. We tend to think of him as very liberal, and some people would even go as far as to call him a socialist. And he did believe that the government should take an active role in the economy. However, by today's standard, he would be a moderate. He did believe in a very liberal use of the federal government. He did believe in the federal government as an instrument of reform, which are very liberal ideas. However, he also, as we're going to see, could be very conservative about issues like civil rights and things such as that. He's married to a woman who is a very extraordinary woman by the name of Eleanor Roosevelt, who is actually the niece of Theodore Roosevelt and also probably the fourth or fifth cousin of FDR. But as weird as that is, she turns into an absolutely great First Lady. In fact, she changes the role of First Lady. When we think about the great First Ladies of Jacqueline Kennedy or the very active First Ladies like Hillary Clinton or Michelle Obama, they got a lot of what they did from Eleanor Roosevelt. She was really involved in FDR's policy. She was often called the conscience of the New Deal. She was an advocate for women. She was a feminist. She was an advocate for children. She hated child labor, the poor. She was a big advocate in pushing Franklin Delano Roosevelt for immediate relief for the poor. But she was also a civil rights advocate. She was the first lady to sit down and actually have a meal at the same table as African Americans, which was significant because, as we said, FDR could be pretty conservative when it came to civil rights. As we get in and we're about to start talking about the physical New Deal itself. We need to keep a couple of things in perspective, and that is the three major goals of the New Deal, the three things that the New Deal is trying to accomplish. And we remember these things by the three R's. The first R is relief. When we think about relief, we're trying to answer the question, how can we help those who are in need right now? How do we help the Americans who are struggling right now? The next one is recovery. When we think of recovery, what that is saying is, how do we get out of the Great Depression? How do we fix the economy and get back to where we were in the 1920s and get out of this depression? And the last one is reform. Reform is very long term. Reform is, how do we ensure that nothing like this ever happens again? Okay, so to go over that again, three R's. Relief, okay, helping those in need right now. Recovery, getting out of the Great Depression. And reform, making sure that the Great Depression can never happen again. As we're going to see, relief is going to be pretty successful. Recovery, not as successful, and reform is going to be very influential because a lot of those reforms, like Social Security, like the SEC, still around today. All right, so we're going to start talking about the actual New Deal itself. So what is the New Deal? It is a series of legislation done by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Democratic Congress between the years 1932 and 1938, okay, aimed at those three R's, relief, recovery, and reform, in dealing with the Great Depression. So let's go ahead and start with the most pressing issue of the day in 1932, which was to try to fix the banking crisis, trying to fix the banking crisis that was going on in 1933. Of course, by 1933, 1/4 of all banks in the United States had failed. So FDR has to attempt to fix the banking system, to try to make sure that banks stop failing, that runs on banks stop taking place. But he also has to figure out how to restore the American faith in banking. Because if you're an American and you just saw all these banks fail, you're not going to want to put your money back in a bank. If you're an American thinking about opening up a small business, but you know that banks have a tendency to fail and destroy your small business, you're not going to want to open up a small business. So he's got to restore American faith in banks. The first thing that he's going to do is something that you'll have to know is the Emergency Banking Relief Act of 1933. The Emergency Banking Relief Act of 1933. It essentially gives the Treasury Department authority over all banks in the United States. So again, the Treasury Department, part of the executive branch, is going to have authority to open banks and to merge banks together when some banks were unsound. It also provides funds to the Federal Reserve to back up banks to ensure that they don't fail. Some other things that he's going to do, he's going to fix the American currency because the value of the American dollar had gone down so much. He removes the United States from the gold standard. He wants to increase the money supply and create a managed currency where literally the federal government has the power to manage the currency of the United States. Other banking reform. This one is, you'll also need to know, it's called HOLC. HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The Homeowners Loan Corporation. It will refinance mortgages for over 1 million homes. It also does a huge decrease to the interest rate, which allows Americans to buy homes. So on one hand, it allows Americans to try to refinance their homes to avoid full foreclosure. But also allows more Americans to buy homes, to take out loans to buy homes at much smaller interest rates. It was especially helpful for the middle class. The middle class is going to be the class that benefits from this the most. The next thing, which is really important because it was around until just a few years ago, is the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act. Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, 1933. It creates the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, and what it's going to do is it's going to insure the money that people put in banks. The federal government will insure it up to $5,000. Okay, so if you put $5,000 into a bank and that bank failed, the government would insure your money. So you would still get that $5,000 back, but from the government. And again, this is trying to get people to resume their confidence in banks and to continue to put their money in banks. Okay, so if you have $7,500 in a bank and that bank fails, the government gives you $5,000 back. Okay, it's trying to reimpose our confidence in banks. The other thing that Glass-Steagall is going to do is it's going to separate commercial banking from investment banking, which is a big deal because remember, banks before 1929 were using the people's money that people had put in banks to invest in the economy and to buy stocks that were very risky and over speculate on stocks, and that was one of the main causes of the 1929 Great Crash. So this is going to try to get rid of that. It's also going to start regulating banks. Okay, and to get into that, we have the Security and Exchange Commission, commonly referred to as the SEC. And this is very important. This is reform, and the SEC is still around today. The SEC is essentially, we're going to simplify this a little bit, they are designed to be a police force for the stock market. They're essentially there to protect the public against fraud by stockbrokers and banks and big businesses when it comes to the value of their stock. So it's trying to make sure, A, that people can't over speculate on how much their stock is worth. A company can't claim their stock is worth a whole lot more than it actually is. It's also trying to get rid of the manipulation of the stock market. One thing it specifically goes after is inside trading, where people can get inside information on a company and then dump stocks or buy stocks based on that information. That's very illegal today. So the SEC, still around today, trying to monitor the banks and the stockbrokers to make sure they're not doing anything nefarious against the interest of the American people. So that gives us the Emergency Banking Act, the HOLC, Glass-Steagall, and the SEC. Those are the big ones I want you to know. Those are the big ones as far as banking that I want you to know about how FDR goes after trying to fix the banking crisis. So the next crisis that FDR has to try to figure out how to deal with is the crisis of unemployment. Remember, unemployment was hovering right around 33% when FDR became president. So it is a major, major problem for the United States. And we need to think of this in the grand scheme of things. How is this affecting the economy as a whole? Obviously, it's terrible for the people who are unemployed, but it also is bringing down the national economy. If people are unemployed, they're not receiving an income, they're not receiving wages. If they're not receiving wages, they're not going to buy things. They're not going to invest in the economy and buy goods. If people stop buying goods, then all the companies that sell those goods are going to start losing money and start to fail. If those people start to fail, the first thing that they're going to do is they're going to start laying off people, which will just create more unemployed people who won't invest in the economy, which will just make more businesses fail. So it's a really horrible cycle of unemployment and business failure. So he's going to try to fix unemployment. He's going to do this through a multitude of ways. The first way that I want to talk about is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. What this is it's in the name, relief. It's called FERA, Federal Emergency Relief Administration. They're literally going to try to relieve the people who are unemployed by literally giving them a check from the federal government. We call these checks dole payments, D-O-L-E, dole payments. And what these are is literally a check from the federal government given to unemployed people. Another thing that they're going to try to do is they're going to try to create jobs. Now, they do this through a number of different ways. Some are successful, some are complete and utter failures. We'll start with a complete and utter failure, and that is the Civil Works Administration. This was a part of FERA, and what it did was it essentially got unemployed men in a particular region, and it got those men to do pretty menial tasks such as raking leaves or sweeping streets or digging ditches, and then it would pay them for doing those pretty mundane, unimportant things. The biggest problem with this, beyond the fact that they were essentially paying people for jobs that we didn't actually need done and that didn't help the economy, was that the men who worked the jobs absolutely hated it. No one wants to rake leaves for a living. And so it was very unpopular, and it got terminated after less than a year. Another thing that didn't quite work was the PWA, the Public Works Administration. Now, this one was a good idea in theory, but it didn't work in practice. The idea was that it was going to grant $4 billion to state and local governments to provide jobs for their employers. So literally the federal government is going to give money to states and to local counties, and then those counties are going to use that money to build public works projects like bridges, dams, schools, hospitals, sewage systems, highways, and then they're going to hire the men from their region or their state to do that. The problem is that when the states get the money, they didn't use it for what it was supposed to be used for, and so it doesn't actually help anything, and they're going to try to fix that later. So now let's move to a few things that did work. The first thing is the very popular Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. This was one of the most popular programs by the New Deal, and it's targeted towards men between the ages of 18 and 24. Now, this is probably the reason it's targeted to those individuals is because men between the age of 18 and 24 are among the most volatile people in society. First off, they were one of the biggest groups affected by the unemployment because they had never worked before, most of them, and so they were trying to get jobs and there just weren't any. And so they were among the biggest group of unemployed peoples. The second is that men between the age of 18 and 24 typically are very easily agitated. And if you ever see any of the big revolutions and you ever look into it, I can guarantee you 18 to 24-year-old men often make up the backbone of a lot of revolutions because they're not opposed necessarily to extreme action. And so in giving the Civilian Conservation Corps and giving these people jobs, what the government is able to do is they're able to take one of the most volatile and vulnerable groups and put them to work. And it also establishes a sort of, it's like a military program, but instead of going and fighting, they're building stuff. This included things like they would plant trees, they would fight fires, they would fight floods, they would drain swamps, they would help create national parks. It was militaristic. You slept in a barracks, you had officers, you had leave. It was also segregated between African Americans and white people, so it was very like the military, but it was very popular and it was pretty successful in employing 18 to 24-year-old men. The most successful thing they do to fight unemployment is the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. WPA, Works Progress Administration. This doesn't come around until 1935, and it is sort of a branch off of the PWA. It takes what the PWA wanted to do, and it essentially makes it a lot better. So it's the same idea. They're going to give money to local authorities to build public works projects, but they're going to enforce that that's what the money is used for. By 1938, about 40% of the labor force is employed by some sort of WPA program. So it is widely successful. They build lots of buildings, bridges, airports, schools, hospitals, a ton of roads. So it's very, very successful. It also creates the Federal Arts Project, which employs artists to help them work alongside all of the WPA programs. It hires artists and musicians and things like that. And it also has the National Youth Administration, or the NYA. It's part of the WPA, but it's for people who are in either college or high school. One of the big problems that was happening is that as parents lost their jobs and made less money, they would be forced to get their kids to go work to add income to the family. And so kids would drop out of school to go work full-time jobs. That creates a big problem because we as a society want to be better educated. We want people to go to school. So to fix this problem, they come up with the NYA, which gives companies money to employ part-time jobs to kids who were in school. And so the catch here is that to get one of these NYA jobs, you had to be a full-time student. So it was a part-time job for students, and it helped students stay in school. So let's look at how effective were these unemployment programs. They were somewhat effective. They did bring down the unemployment rate. However, the unemployment rate never goes below 14%. And so it's not actually until World War II that the unemployment problem is going to be fixed. Alright, so the last problem that we're going to deal with in this first lecture, this part 1 of the New Deal, is going to be the farming crisis. The group that was probably hit hardest by everything that happened in the Great Depression were farmers. And now this is going to be compounded by the fact that the Dust Bowl is also going to be happening at the same time. But let's just start by talking the problem that really was hurting farmers, which is the overproduction of goods, the overproduction of grain, the overproduction of meat, all this stuff which they're overproducing. Remember, American farming had exploded during World War I because American farmers were now responsible for feeding pretty much the entire globe. However, after World War I ends, the European farmers recover. All those European farmers who had been drafted into service go back to their farms. All the farms that had been destroyed by the war get rebuilt. Now all of a sudden, Europe doesn't need American farming anymore. This leaves American farmers with a problem because they continue to produce the same amount of goods that they were producing during World War I. This creates a surplus of farming goods. And when there's a surplus, when the supply is super high, it makes the price go down. Now you also add that the demand is going down. That also makes the price go down. So the price for goods, the price for food, was incredibly cheap. Good for people who need to buy food. Really bad for the people producing the food. Okay, so farmers are getting killed by the deflation of food prices. And so by 1933, when FDR becomes president, about a fourth of farmers have lost their farms. We also need to remember that the farming industry is not equal. Just like every other industry in America, farming is often controlled by big businesses, these giant farms. And those farms are really taking it out of the small farmers. So the people who are really struggling are not those giant farms, it's the small farmers who just can't compete with these big farms and are also being killed by the low price of food. And we should also say that this is a problem that continues to get worse because if food prices drop, the only way you're going to make money is to produce more food. But if you produce more food, the surplus gets bigger, and therefore the price of food continues to drop. So farmers are just getting killed. each and every way. So the first thing that the Roosevelt administration is going to do is the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA. Okay, not the car kind of AAA, but the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. What it's going to do is it's going to attempt to eliminate price-depressing surpluses by paying growers to reduce their crop acreage. Now that is just a fancy way of saying we're going to give farmers money to produce less food. We're going to give you cash, and in return you're not going to grow as much food. The goal is to get farm production back to its pre-World War I level. However, it doesn't really work because those subsidies were never enough to really convince farmers to do what they had to do. And so the production levels never actually decrease. The one good thing about the AAA is that it does destroy the cropland system, the sharecropping system, mainly because sharecroppers no longer could produce as much food, and so the owners of the land would get rid of the sharecroppers. Sharecroppers would move into the city, and so it kind of destroys the sharecropping system. The AAA is eventually killed in court by a case called Butler versus United States, Butler versus U.S. And what Butler versus U.S. says is that the federal government doesn't actually have the right to tell farmers how much they can and can't grow. Now, as I've said before, as this is all happening, one of the worst ecological disasters in American history happens at the same time. And it's a really, really horrible coincidence, and that is the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was a major drought that strikes the Trans-Mississippi Great Plains. So those states that are on the western side of the Mississippi River, they're the ones that are going to get killed by this, specifically Kansas, Oklahoma, the northern part of Texas, the eastern part of Colorado. They're really going to get killed here. And due to this, due to their inability to grow crops, due to the Dust Bowl, about 350,000 Oklahomans, Kansans, Coloradans are going to migrate west to California, specifically the northern part of California. And this is where we start to see California balloon as a state. At the time, it was just a mid-sized state that had a very large area but not a very large population. Now, of course, it is the largest state by a lot. And this is where it all starts. To help this, the government comes up with the Resettlement Act, which comes up with these small communities where the government gives people money once they resettle to try to figure themselves out, to try to find a job. We also have one of the great pieces of American literature which is written at this time, and that is The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, which is considered one of the great American novels. And it's often called the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the Dust Bowl, because just like Uncle Tom's Cabin brought the Americans' attention to slavery, The Grapes of Wrath brings Americans' attention to the problems facing the people who live in the Great Plains who are having to migrate out to California due to the Dust Bowl. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is the REA, that is the Rural Electrification Administration. And what that does is it provides loans to the WPA programs to build electricity out in rural areas, to try to connect rural areas to the electric grids of the cities. And it goes a long way. The reason we're talking about this is obviously y'all all live in a very rural area which was affected by this, is because it takes all these rural areas that were so far away from the cities and the electric grids and the technology, and it connects them for the first time. So that wraps up what we're going to talk about today. Again, we're dividing the New Deal into two parts. So today we recapped how the Great Depression started. We talked about FDR and the New Deal and his plan. We talked about the 3 Rs: relief, recovery, and reform. We talked about what FDR did for the banks. Mainly, we talked about the Emergency Banking Act. We talked about the HOLC. We talked about Glass-Steagall. We talked about the SEC. We talked about how he combated unemployment with the CCC, with FARA, the CWA, the PWA, and the WPA. And then finally, we left off by talking about farming. all the problems that farmers were facing, the attempt to fix those problems by decreasing production with the AAA, and how that was killed by Butler versus U.S. And finally, we talked about the Dust Bowl and the effects of the Dust Bowl. So we're going to stop there for today. On Thursday, we will finish all this up with the New Deal Part 2, where we'll start to talk about how the effects of the New Deal on the industry, on housing, and finally, some of those really big things that still exist today, which is Social Security, Indian reorganization, and then finally, we're going to end it all by just talking about how effective was the New Deal. Was the New Deal successful? And this is a very debatable topic that people and historians are still debating today. So other than that, remember we have a meeting on Thursday, so be ready for that. I'll be sending out an email reminding you of that. Looking forward to talking to you all, and looking forward to the New Deal Part 2 coming to you Thursday.